Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Dairy Australia webinar. Today's topic is Virtual Herding Project Introduction. We are pleased to welcome our presenter for today, Ray King. This webinar is live and interactive, and you are encouraged to participate by posting questions to the presenter, which can be typed into the chat box at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you experience audio difficulty during the webinar, please dial the 1-800 support number listed in the chat box. I'll now hand over to Ray.
Thanks, Tyler. Just to introduce myself, I'm Ray King. I've been appointed by Dairy Australia to manage the Virtual Herding Project on behalf of the Australian Government Department of Agriculture and Water Resources and the Livestock Research and Development Corporation. As a research consultant for the past 10 years, I've developed and managed and reviewed a number of R&D projects and programs, particularly for Dairy Australia, the Australian Pork Limited and the Pork Cooperative Research Centre. This webinar is the first in a series of webinars to present to particularly members of the farmer panel. We have 25 or so farmers across the livestock industries that have agreed to contribute to this project. So we're keen to present them details and progress of the Virtual Herding Project. And this project is supported by Australian Government Department of Agriculture and Water Resources as part of its Rural R&D for Profit program. This presentation provides an overview of the technology and the Virtual Herding Project. Firstly, we'd just like to explain the principles of virtual herding. Firstly, you're all aware of the conventional electric fence. The animal sees it. The animal then will make contact with that fence, and there's a response. It gets a small electric shock, and its response is to avoid that fence. So it learns quite quickly that once it sees the electric fence, it avoids going close to it as it risks getting a shock. So it does learn quite quickly. The same similar principle for the virtual herding or a virtual fence. Again, the animal approaches the boundary. It cannot see a fence, but it hears a sound. There's an audio. If it goes further, then it gets the electrical stimulation. And that, for the virtual herding, the strength of that's about 1/10 of an electric fence. So it gets that shock, the response is to avoid it, and it learns, again, quite quickly. So if it hears an audio cue, then it avoids going any further, as because it's learned that if they do, they get that electric stimulus. So it works on a similar principle. In this case, it's audio sound. It's not a visual sound, a visual look of a fence. So this work in virtual fencing in Australia started about 10 years ago, in about 2004, 2005, and it was conducted by CSIRO. They developed some basic collars, which they used on animals and demonstrated the principles. So they certainly demonstrated that cattle can learn an association between an audio cue and an electrical stimuli to remain within a virtual fence boundary. And they found that the audio stimulus was equally as effective as the electric stimulus alone. So that you, certainly over a very short time, reduce the number of electrical stimuli that the animals receive, because they do respond to that audio. And CSIRO also did quite a bit of work in looking at the welfare of the animals with this system, and those results certainly suggested that the stress response of cattle to low energy electrical stimuli is quite minimal and is similar to that induced by physical restraint and a crush. So that was done about 10 years ago. So CSIRO certainly established the fundamental components for virtual fencing. It was ethical. Animals could quickly learn to avoid electrical stimulus by responding to an audio cue alone. And they did quite a bit of work on a welfare assessment of the animals, both physiological and behavioural response, and certainly there was no adverse effect on the welfare of the cattle. It was certainly effective. It contains animals within a fence boundary. It's not 100%, but for some cases or some uses, it's certainly to a level that we can certainly live with. And they did some work at Dolmite Research Station up in central Queensland. This was work done by Greg Bishop-Hurley, where they demonstrated how they could keep animals out of a riparian zone. So what they did, they had a river down here. They put a virtual fence boundary along here, and they were able to keep the animals away from the river. In fact, over that time, there was probably 98% success rate for the first 14 days. So you can see where there's very few animals that crossed over that virtual fence. And it's interesting to note that these were naive beef cattle. So certainly they demonstrated that the technology could certainly keep cattle out of certain areas. So as I say, that work was done over 10 years ago. The outcomes from that work, certainly 2 patents resulting from that research, so strong patents protecting that technology. As I mentioned, there was a longer-term study that certainly demonstrated that you could keep animals away from certain areas, or the majority of animals away from certain areas. And probably 3 or 4 years ago, a small biotech company, Attractant, who is the CEO is Ian Riley, they licensed the CSIRO IP to commercialise the virtual fencing system. And since then, they've attracted financial investment and a strong relationship with Gallagher's in New Zealand. So they're very in a strong position to protect the IP against other companies that propose to develop this virtual herding technology. And there are a number of companies that are looking at a similar technology. So Attractant have been developing the devices, producing prototypes, developing the collars, algorithms, the GPS device, also the power supply. So they've been active in developing prototypes, which we have used in some of the studies, and we hope to use in future within the project. So the development of this project, it started, I guess, in the second half of 2015. DAWR Australia did run a workshop in Melbourne in August of that year to try and identify some of the ways that this technology might be used, and looked at sort of what the cost benefit would be for the industry. So there was pretty positive outcomes from that workshop. There's further discussions with the other livestock industries, and towards the end of 2015, DAWR Australia facilitated with a help of these R&D providers and other RDC partners to put a proposal to the Australian Government Department of Agriculture and Water Resources. That was put in December, and subsequently they supported it. So the R&D project was to begin July 1 of last year. So it's supported with $2.6 million over 4 years from the Australian Government, Department of Agriculture and Water Resources, as part of its Rural R&D program. The RDC partners, Dairy Australia, are managing it on behalf of the RDCs, Meat and Livestock Australia, Australian Wool Innovation, Australian Pork Limited. The R&D providers, Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture, University of Tasmania at Burnie, University of Sydney at Camden, the University of Melbourne, the Rural Sociology Group, University of New England at Armidale, CSIRO, mainly from Armidale, and Adjacent. And these other partners have contributed up to about $1.4 million cash as well. So it's about $4 million cash, plus significant in-kind from the R&D providers and the RDCs. So that project was due to start July 1. The aim was to look at using virtual herding to examine the potential to constrain animals to certain areas. In terms of better grazing management in strip grazing, keep them away from certain areas, so keep riparian zones, keep them out of wet areas, keep them out of overgrazed areas. And probably that's one of the first applications which will be able to be used. Move animals around the farm, so where cows are brought into the dairy shed twice a day or sheep are brought into a shearing shed occasionally. Possibility of being able to herd those animals by shifting the virtual fence behind the group of animals. And finally, whether we can move individual animals or groups of animals in a herd differently to the rest of the herd, which so let certain animals into a certain area or bring out small groups of animals into whether it's a dairy shed or a shearing shed on a regular basis. So there was quite a lot of potential uses for the technology, and this project is looking at doing the R&D to identify how this can be done. As well as the actual work with the animals, the project will also develop an understanding of the learning, management and ethical challenges faced by farmers that may implement virtual herding on their farms. And that's, as I mentioned, done by the University of Melbourne Social Science Group. In all those animal studies, detailed measures on the welfare status of the animals will be made, both physiological, such as cortisol, body temperature, and behavioural responses, looking at time budgets, not only the response to the cues themselves. So it's quite an extensive program of work. It's divided into 5 sub-programs, and each one's led by one of the organisations, and particularly by a postdoc that's been appointed to the project. We've been able to attract 5 excellent postdoctoral fellows to the project, one for each of the sub-programs. The ones involved in the animal studies, they were able to be appointed during December, January, February of this year. The one from the University of Melbourne, I'll come to later, started in June of this year. So we've got Carolyn Lee, who's a research scientist at CSIRO, and Dana Campbell, from CSIRO, who's the postdoctoral fellow. So they're probably the ones that started the first. They've conducted experiments both on-site at Armidale and later they'll do them on commercial farms. And their aim is optimise the cues and controls necessary for the efficient operation of virtual herding technology. So they've, in future webinars, we'll ask each of those groups to present some of their results as the R&D program develops. But already they've been looking at the pulse duration, what's required, the pulse level, and they've been able to identify an optimum duration and level of the pulse, electrical pulse, which is consistent with being able to control the animal and also consistent with good welfare outcomes. Determine how the animal responds to moving in more complex virtual fences. So if a fence is moved quite often, how quickly they learn that it's moved, and whether a fence is straight or crooked, those sort of things. So that work will be done. Initial work shows that just in the initial sort of pilot work, over 90% of the animals are contained in an area when fences are moved regularly, even every couple of days. And they'll look at doing some studies on commercial herds, commercial farms that use the technology to either restrict or encourage the movement of cattle. Sub-program 2 is led by Megan Verdon, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Tasmanian Institute of Ag, along with Mark Freeman and Richard Rawnsley, who's the supervisor. And they'll conduct experiments on site at the dairy research facility at Elliott, and they're mainly interested in looking at how we can improve pasture utilisation through the use of virtual herding technology, with the idea that moving the virtual fence frequently during the day will allow an animal, all cows, to be presented with fresh pasture and hopefully greater pasture utilisation. They've started the work down there. The suitable prototypes are not yet available to use it in grazing management. The GPS technology at the moment is accurate to about plus or minus 5 metres, which is probably not close enough for pasture utilisation and strip grazing, but very shortly it will be within a metre or so. So soon we'll have suitable prototypes to do that sort of work down at the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture. So in the meantime, they're manually moving the fence regularly during the grazing allocation period. Again, we'll get Megan to present some of those results at a later webinar. The third sub-program is led by Dr. Sabrina Lomax at the University of Sydney, and she'll, along with Cameron Clark, will conduct field experiments. And they're looking at individual variation among cattle, both dairy cows and beef cows. When is the best time to learn the association between sound and electrical stimulation? Do animals forget it over time? So a lot of the work in also how we might be able to manage individual animals or groups of animals within a herd differently from the rest of the herd. Certainly, there's a large variation between individual animals in how they respond, but the early work from CSIRO indicates that there seems to be less variation in response between individuals when they're in groups. So that's a positive. Sub-program 4, this is focused on sheep. Now, we certainly understand that collars for sheep may not be practical or economic, but it's likely that the virtual herding technology could be delivered by an ear tag. That may be possible in future years. So we're certainly doing some basic work looking at using virtual herding to better manage sheep. And Danila Marini from UNE, along with the project team at CSIRO, was conducting experiments up at Armidale. And again, concentrating on looking at the response of sheep to virtual herding, because all the early work was done with cattle, and there's only been a very little bit of work, basic work done with sheep. And in this work, initially, again, we'll look at using manual collars, where rather than the prototypes, manual collars are where the researcher has to actually press the audio button and then provide electrical stimulation themselves while observing the stock, whereas prototypes deliver it automatically. And I'll show a couple of videos later on how these animals respond. The fifth sub-program is led by Ruth Nettle and Nikki Reichelt, who joined the project just last month. And they're looking at the challenges the farmers may face with using the technology. You know, actually using the technology, the knowledge required, the costs certainly would come into it. If there's not 100% response, what's for some uses, is that okay? Those sort of things. So this sub-program will really rely a lot on members of the farmer panel to have greater input into this area. Nikki, as I say, started last month, and she certainly may contact some of you soon to help establish focus groups, case studies, to help with this sub-program, just to examine some of the challenges and opportunities for virtual herding technology in the livestock industry. So these are some of the project team members. Dana Campbell from CSIRO had worked in poultry behaviour welfare. Megan Verdon from the University of Tasmania has previously worked in pig welfare. Did I say Dana worked in poultry? Carolyn Lee, she did the initial work on virtual herding back in 2000. Sabrina Lomax previously worked in pain management in husbandry procedures for sheep. Danila Marini supervising the more basic studies looking at responses of sheep. And Mark Freeman from the University of Tasmania at Elliott as well. So this was taken up at Armidale early in the year to have when we had a look at some of the early work. Just to give you a flavour of some of the work that's already started, and this may be presented in future webinars, which we hope to hold every 2 to 3 months. Work done looking at an artificial situation where animals entered a paddock over 4 or 5 days. From that entry point, they knew where the hay was, fresh lucerne hay, so they went there immediately. So these animals learned very quickly to go directly to the hay, and then after 4 or 5 days, a virtual fence was put across that paddock. we'll put across there. So I've got a couple of videos which just shows where animals, how they respond to that virtual fence that was put in the paddock after they'd learned to go from the entry gate to the hay. And they learned, as I say, very quickly that after 4 or 5 days that certainly the hay was there, so they went immediately to it. Tyler, can we have a couple of the first video now, please? I think it was cow 535. So here's a cow approaching the fence, which is just coming up. It's probably ignored the audio, but certainly got the electrical stimulation. So Tyler, I think we can go to the next video, cow 508. Here's another cow that approaches the virtual fence, which is identified by the tape on the fence, either side. So again, he's probably responded to the audio. Tyler, could we have that one again, please? You see the animal. It's the audio. Doesn't go any further and turns around. Okay, Tyler, can we do the next one, please? Here's the animal, cattle. It just leaves the entry gate, knows where the feed is, walks straight up, across the paddock. Here's the audio and turns around and goes back. It knows there's loose and hay at the end, but it responds very quickly. These animals learn, certainly within a couple of days, the relationship between the audio and the electrical stimulation. Tyler, we've got a couple of the sheep videos. Can you show the first one where hay is put in the middle of the paddock and the sheep, so this is sheep that wants to get to its mate, sees its mates in the middle, gets the audio, ignores it, gets the electrical stimulation and runs away. So it's just learning to the association. It still wants to join its mates, gets the audio, knows that it shouldn't go any further. And leaves. Tyler, do you want to show the other sheep video? Again, I think this one, next one will be hay in the middle of the paddock. Yep, and the sheep can get access to it from all around. Gets close, but gets the audio and it's learned to associate that with the electrical stimulation. So there's just a few examples of how animals do respond. So just to finish off, there's certainly more information and contact details are at the website. We're putting more and more information on that. If we get good feedback, certainly subsequent webinars will present both results from the various sub-programs, but also from Adjuson's commercialisation program on how they expect to roll it out. I'd encourage you to check out the website, copies of fact sheets, presentations. There's a couple of recent ones there. Sabrina presented at presentations. There's a couple of recent ones there. Sabrina presented at the South Australia Dairy Innovation Day. Nigel Tompkins from MLA presented at a beef meeting at Esperance. There's news and other links. And for the farmers that are listening in, certainly I encourage you to contact members of the project team. As I said, Nikki from the University of Melbourne will likely contact you soon. So there'll be more detailed information from those members, and their contact details are on the website. So with that, thanks for listening, and just please send your questions through. I've got one here from Yanni, who asks what percentage of the beef and sheep are responding, and also how consistent is the response for those animals. They all seem to respond, but it's not a consistent response. For beef, cattle, some of the animals actually run through that fence line. That makes us think that you need to have exactly the right pulse, electrical stimulation and audio. But they all do respond. I know Sabrina presented some results at the South Australian Dairy Innovation Day where the response was quite variable. But as I said earlier, the variation between individuals tends to dampen down when they're in groups, so that's promising. But those sort of the answer to those questions will certainly come up as in other presentations from both Sabrina for the dairy cattle and from Dana for the beef cattle. Another question from Nicole or Nikki. What about when livestock needs to be moved beyond the virtual fence when in an emergency situation, accessing water or avoiding danger? Does the animal override the virtual fence? They can, as I mentioned, they do run through it. They're not zapped all the time after that. The idea is they get through it. A virtual fence is then redrawn around those animals to bring them back into that area. But I'd imagine the farmer would have that information on his mobile phone or iPad, and if it is an emergency situation, he could just turn it off. So I think in those situations there wouldn't be any issue. Melina asked, how long will animals remember that an audio cue is followed by an electric shock? For example, if used with sheep at shearing, that is very different time frame compared to dairy cattle and cell grazing, for example. Thanks, Melina. That's one of the research questions that we're looking at, both at Sydney and at University of Tasmania, is how the animals learn and how long do they remember that for. So animals will be, the technology will be imposed, so at 6 months of age, 12 months, 18 months. So they'll get to learn. We'll understand how long they remember it for, but with electric fences, they seem to remember it for a fair time. So that sort of work will be done, and the sheep work will certainly be done by Danila at University of New England. So these questions will be kept, and certainly the researchers will appreciate these sort of questions that might prompt them to to incorporate that into their research program. There's no other questions coming forward. Thanks very much, as I say, for attending. I will contact particularly the members of the farmer panel, get some feedback from them of whether this time in the day suits them or they prefer something else. But I encourage everyone to check out the website, which we try and keep up to date every couple of weeks or so. So thanks for your attendance, and I'll hand back to Tyler.
Thank you, Ray, and for your presentation. And thank you to everyone today for attending this webinar. Have yourself a pleasant afternoon, and we'll see you next time.